Welcome to Hearths of Myths. Today, the mist rolls in from the cold Atlantic, and the waves crash against black stone. We are staring into the ancient abyss of the Fomorian King, Balor of the Evil Eye. Close your eyes, settle in, and let the darkness deepen. Long before the scribes of Christendom set quill to parchment, and deeper still into the mists of time before the sons of Mill, the ancestors of modern humanity, ever set foot upon the emerald turf of Ireland, the world was a place of raw, untamed forces. It was an age when the boundaries between the solid earth, the churning sea, and the other world were porous and shifting. In this primordial epoch, the island of Eriu was not a pastoral paradise of green hills and gentle rains, but a wild, tempestuous realm dominated by powers that defied the ordered laws of nature. It is here, in the shadow of prehistory, that we find the Fomorians. To understand Balor, one must first understand the blood that coursed through his immense veins. The Fomorians, or Fomor, in the ancient tongues, were not merely a tribe of raiders, as some later histories might suggest. They were the personification of the chaotic, destructive powers of nature. They were the beings of the undersea, the Fomor, dwellers in the crushing depths where light could not penetrate, and masters of the darker aspects of the earth, while the Tuatha Dé Danann, who would come later, represented the arts, civilization, light, and growth. The Fomorians were the storm that flattens the corn, the blight that rots the grain in the stalk, the mist that hides the treacherous cliff edge, and the winter cold that seeps into the bone. They were a people of monstrous diversity. Some myths whisper that they were descended from the line of Ham, cursed to wander the wild places, while others claim they were the original inhabitants of Ireland, the dark, aboriginal gods who resented any who sought to tame the land. Their forms were often terrifying to behold. Legends speak of Fomorians with the heads of goats upon the bodies of men, or creatures with but a single arm, a single leg, and a single eye, not out of injury, but as a mark of their distinct, other-worldly physiology. Yet, they were not uniform in their monstrosity. Among them were beings of terrifying beauty, dark and brooding, like Alatha, the golden-haired prince who would one day seduce a goddess of the Tuatha Dé Danann. But the lineage of Balor was one of ancient primal power, rooted in the oldest and most formidable of their kind. Balor was born to Buarainek, a name that echoes with the heavy, grinding sound of stone against stone. Buarainek, often translated or interpreted as cow-faced, or possessing a bovine distortion of the visage, was a chieftain of the Fomorians whose very presence commanded the fear of the waves. The genealogy of the Fomorians is a tangled root system, burying itself deep into the bedrock of Irish myth. But it is known that Balor was a direct descendant of Net, a god of war so ancient that his name had become synonymous with conflict itself. Net's influence was like the erratic fury of a thunderstorm, and this volatility was passed down to his grandson. The birth of Balor was not celebrated with the lighting of fires or the singing of bards, but with the churning of the ocean and the howling of the gale. He was born on the remote, spray-lashed crags of Tory Island, Tuired, the island of towers, located off the northwest coast of what is now County Donegal. Tory Island was a natural fortress, a slab of granite rising defiantly from the Atlantic. It was a place where the wind never ceased, stripping the land bare of trees, leaving only the hardiest of life to cling to the rock. This bleak, beautiful, and terrifying landscape was the cradle of the future king of the Fomorians. As an infant, Balor was not like the children of men. He was vast in size, his limbs thick and sturdy as the basalt columns that guarded his island home. Even in his youth, there was a heaviness to his gaze, a weight that unsettled those who looked upon him. At this stage, however, he was not yet the Balor of the evil eye that legend would come to dread. He was simply Balor, a prince of the chaotic deep, growing strong on the meat of great sea beasts and the milk of the Fomorian herds. The society of the Fomorians was one of strength and occult knowledge. They were not mindless beasts. They possessed a druidry of their own, a dark, chthonic magic that dealt with the manipulation of vapors, the summoning of mists, and the cursing of the land. It was this proximity to the arcane arts of his people that would seal Balor's fate and transform him from a mere giant into a living weapon of mass destruction. The texts of old, such as the Cath Mage Tuired, the Second Battle of Mag Tuired, provide us with glimpses of this transformation. They suggest that the Fomorians were not merely waiting passively on their islands. They were active, conducting rituals, brewing concoctions, and seeking to consolidate their power over the elements. Balor's father, Boarainek, maintained a circle of dark druids, sorcerers who specialized in the arts of corpse magic and the distillation of poisonous energies. Young Balor, curious and bold, roamed the halls of his father's fortress on Tuired. It was a place of shadows and flickering torchlight, where the smell of brine mixed with the acrid scent of burning herbs. He was a creature of potential, a vessel waiting to be filled. But destiny, in Celtic mythology, is rarely a gentle guide. It is often a violent collision. The Fomorians, despite their power, lived in a state of constant wariness, for they knew that other forces coveted the green isle of Eriu. The Nemedians had come and gone, decimated by plague and Fomorian oppression, and the Firbolg held sway over the land. The Fomorians watched from their coastal strongholds, exacting tribute, always hungry for dominion. In this atmosphere of tyranny and magic, Balor grew. He learned the ways of the spear and the sword, weapons crafted from the rough iron of the earth. He learned to sail the black ships of the Fomorians, vessels that cut through the waves like sharks. But it was not his martial prowess that would define him. It was an accident, a moment of curiosity that would curdle his very essence and grant him a power so terrible that even the gods would come to fear it. The tale of how Balor acquired his legendary evil eye is one of the most debated and varied aspects of his mythos. Yet, the most atmospheric and enduring version takes us into the heart of a forbidden ritual. It was not a birth defect, nor a gift from a benevolent deity, but a scar of dark magic, a mutation born of forbidden knowledge. Legend tells us that Balor's father, Boarainek, had commissioned his most powerful druids to brew a potion of immense lethality. This was not a draught for healing or for visions. It was a weapon in liquid form. The druids, clad in robes the color of dried blood, gathered in a secluded chamber, perhaps a cavern beneath the fortress of Tuired, where the sea roared in the darkness below. They stoked a fire with wood that had never seen the sun, feeding a cauldron that bubbled with a thick, noxious mixture. The ingredients of this potion are lost to the decay of ages, but one can imagine the components necessary for such a working: the venom of sea serpents, the roots of plants that grow only in the shade of graves, and the distilled essence of plague and blight. The purpose of this brew was to create a plague that could be unleashed upon the enemies of the Fomorians, a magical, biological weapon that would wither the crops and rot the flesh of the Nemedians, or the Fir Bolg. Balor, then a youth of significant stature but lacking the caution of age, passed by the chamber. The heavy oak doors were ajar, a sliver of sickly green light spilling into the corridor. Driven by the arrogance of his lineage and the curiosity of the young, he peered inside. At that precise moment, the potion reached its critical boiling point. The druids chanted the final syllable of a binding spell, and the cauldron erupted. A cloud of venomous steam, thick and oily, surged upwards. It was not merely hot, it was magically active, seeking a host. As Balor peered through the crack in the door, the fumes struck him directly in the face, but they did not burn his skin in the way of normal fire. The dark magic condensed and seeped into his eye, his right eye, according to many traditions, though some say the left, and others claim it was a third eye situated in the center of his forehead. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. It was the sensation of 1,000 stinging insects burrowing into the pupil, of ice and fire warring within the optic nerve. Balor roared, a sound that shook the dust from the ceiling of the fortress, and fell back, clutching his face. The druids rushed to the door, terrified that their work had been interrupted. But the damage was done. The vapors of the spell, the concentrated essence of death and destruction, had been absorbed by the young giant's eye. For days and nights, Balor lay in a fevered dream. His body writhed as the magic assimilated into his physiology. The eye swelled, growing to monstrous proportions, pushing against the bone of his skull. It turned a color that existed nowhere in nature, a chaotic swirl of crimson, black, and a dead, sickly yellow. When the fever finally broke, Balor was changed. He was no longer just a Fomorian warrior. He was a conduit for the destructive energies of the void. When he first opened the eye, the result was catastrophic. It is said that the first gaze fell upon a serving girl who had come to tend to him. In an instant, she did not just die. She withered. Her life force was vacuumed out, her skin turning to ash, her bones brittle as dry twigs. The stone wall behind her cracked and blackened as if struck by lightning. Balor quickly realized the horror and the utility of his condition. He could not control the beam. If the eye was open, it destroyed. It killed organic life. It shattered stone. It boiled water. To gaze upon his own father would be to slay him. To look at his own hands would be to wither them. The eye had to be contained. Thus began the construction of the apparatus that would become iconic in Irish mythology. Balor, now feared by his own kin, ordered the forging of a massive eyelid. Since he could not close the eye through muscular effort alone, due to its immense size and the pressure of the magic within, mechanical aid was required. The smiths of the Fomorians, skilled in working with cold iron and bronze, fashioned a system of rings and pulleys. Legends vary on the exact mechanism. Some describe a heavy, polished ring set into the lid, requiring the strength of 4 warriors to hoist open. Others speak of 7 layers of heavy cloaks or shields, specifically treated to resist the heat and venom of the gaze. In the folklore of County Mayo, it is said that Balor kept the eye covered with 9 leather shields. When battle was joined, or when he wished to unleash devastation, he would order the coverings removed one by one. The reveal of the eye was a weapon of escalation. With the removal of the first covering, the ferns and bracken in his line of sight would begin to wither. With the second, the grass would turn the color of copper. With the third, the forests would begin to smoke. By the time the final covering was removed, the land would be engulfed in flames, rocks would melt, and entire armies would be reduced to dust. This power cemented Balor's position among the Fomorians. He was no longer just a prince. He was the ultimate deterrent. Even the most ambitious of his rivals bowed before him, for who could stand against a look that brought instant death? He became the High King of the Fomorians, ruling from his fortress on Tory Island, a tyrant whose gaze reached across the waves to the mainland of Ireland. However, with great power came a gnawing paranoia. The Fomorians were creatures of prophecy, as much as they were creatures of chaos. The Druids of Buarainek, the same circle who had inadvertently created the evil eye, cast the runes and consulted the clouds regarding their new king's future. They sought to know the length of his reign and the manner of his death, as was customary for kings of that age. The prophecy they delivered was a shard of ice in Balor's heart. They foretold that Balor would indeed rule long and wield terrible power. But his end would not come from a stranger, nor from a god of the Tuatha Dé Danann in fair combat. The Druids whispered the doom that haunts tyrants across all mythologies. You shall be killed by the hand of your own grandson. The specific wording of the prophecy in the Cath Mage Tuired tradition and later folklore emphasizes the familial betrayal. It was not a son who would kill him, for Balor, knowing this, might simply have refused to sire sons, but the son of his daughter. The lineage would loop back upon itself to destroy him. This revelation twisted Balor's mind. He looked upon his court, his warriors, and his family with the suspicion of a hunted animal. He had only one child, a daughter named Ethniu, sometimes called Ethna or Ethlin. She was fair of face, a stark contrast to the monstrous visage of her father, possessing the tall, statuesque beauty of the noble Fomorian bloodline. To Balor, she was no longer a beloved daughter. She was the vessel of his destruction. She was the flaw in his armor, the open gate through which his death would march. He could have killed her. It would have been the simplest solution for a being who embodied destruction. Yet, perhaps some shred of paternal instinct remained, or perhaps he feared that spilling his own blood would incur a different, more immediate curse from the primal forces the Fomorians worshipped. Instead of filicide, he chose incarceration. He would challenge fate by ensuring that Ethniu would never know the touch of a man. If she remained a virgin, there would be no grandson. If there was no grandson, Balor would live forever. And so, the order was given to build the tower. It was to be a prison of glass and stone, a monument to a father's fear. Now, let us settle deeper into the shadows of Tory Island, where the wind whistles through the jagged rocks like the spirits of the restless dead. We have witnessed the accident, the alchemical catastrophe, that transformed Balor from a mere giant of the Fomorians into a living cataclysm. But a weapon, no matter how potent, is useless without a mechanism of control. And a king, no matter how powerful, is nothing without the crushing weight of authority. The transformation of Balor's eye was not a static event. It was a continuous, agonizing evolution. The eye did not merely destroy, It hungered. It pulsed with a chaotic energy that sought to unmake the world around it. To leave it uncovered was to invite ruin upon his own fortress, his own fleets, and his own kin. The texts of the Leabhar Gabhala Erean, the Book of Invasions, and the oral traditions collected in the northern counties describe the terrible necessity of binding this power. Balor summoned the greatest smiths of the Fomorian host. These were not the bright, artistic smiths of the Tuatha Dé Danann like Gaibhnenn, who worked with silver and gold to create beauty. These were heavy-handed artisans who worked with cold iron, lead, and the black stones of the earth. They were tasked with creating a containment system for a biological singularity. The resulting apparatus was a marvel of primitive, brutal engineering. Legend tells us that the eyelid had grown so heavy, swollen with the venomous humors of the dark magic, that the muscles of Balor's face could no longer lift it. The flesh had become like petrified wood, stiff and unyielding. To solve this, the smiths forged a massive ring of polished iron, driven directly into the cartilage of the lid. Through this ring, they threaded thick chains that clanked with a heavy, dull sound that would become the anthem of Balor's presence. These chains were run through a system of pulleys and blocks anchored to the back of Balor's high throne, or, in some versions, attached to a harness worn by his personal guard. It required the strength of 4 of the strongest Fomorian champions to haul the lid open. Imagine the scene in the great hall of Tuired. The air is thick with smoke, and the smell of roasted meat. Balor sits upon a throne of basalt, his head bowed under the weight of his deformity. When he wishes to speak, silence falls. But when he wishes to strike, there is the grinding of gears, the straining of muscles, and the terrified gasps of the court. As the champions pull the chains, the lid slowly rises. The first sliver of the eye is revealed. A beam of sickly, necrotic light spills forth. It is said that the heat radiating from the eye was so intense that the attendants had to wear protective leathers soaked in water to prevent their skin from blistering. This was the piercing eye of Balor, the Suil na Balor, a gaze that could wither a warrior in his armor as easily as an autumn frost withers a fern. With this weapon, Balor consolidated his rule. The Fomorians, a disparate and chaotic race, fell into line. Who would dare challenge a king who could disintegrate an insurrection with a glance? He became the personification of the inevitable, the inescapable doom. His fleets began to raid the mainland of Ireland with renewed ferocity, demanding tributes of grain, milk, and children from the Nemedians, and later the Fir Bolg. He was the god of the drought and the scorching sun, the king of the blight. But in the ancient world, power always invites prophecy. The Fomorians, despite their monstrous nature, were deeply superstitious. They understood that the universe operated on cycles of rise and fall. Balor, now secure in his physical might, sought to secure his temporal timeline. He needed to know that his reign would be eternal. He called upon his father's druids once more. These were the sorcerers of the deep earth, men and women who read the future in the patterns of bleeding roots and the flight of ravens over stormy seas. They gathered at the precipice of the island, chanting into the gale, seeking the threads of Balor's fate. The ritual was long and harrowing. They sacrificed black bulls and read the steam rising from the blood. They inhaled the vapors of the earth. And when they returned to the throne room, their faces were pale. stripped of the arrogance of magic. They delivered the prophecy that would define the rest of Balor's tragic existence. They did not speak of a great battle against a foreign god, nor of a natural disaster. They spoke of blood. "O King," they whispered, their voices trembling, "your power is absolute, and no man of your generation shall fell you. But the fates have spun a thread you cannot burn. You shall be killed by the hand of your own grandson." The silence that followed was heavier than the iron of the eyelid. For Balor, this was an impossibility that had to be made impossible. He had no sons. He had no intention of siring sons who might grow up to rival him. He had only one child, the fair Ethniu. She was his pride, in a twisted, possessive way, but now she was the carrier of his doom. The prophecy was specific. It was the offspring of his daughter who would deal the killing blow. Logic, cold and ruthless, took hold of Balor's mind. If Ethniu never bore a child, there would be no grandson. If she never knew the touch of a man, never even knew that men existed as beings of desire, the cycle could be broken. He would not just guard her. He would erase the very possibility of conception from her reality. He would construct a world where the concept of fatherhood did not exist. Thus, the order was given. The smiths were called back from the forges of war to the quarries of stone. They were to build a tower. Not a fortress for an army, but a cage for a single flower. The construction of the prison for Ethniu is one of the most atmospheric segments of the Balor mythos. It takes us to the most desolate reaches of the ancient Irish landscape. Tory Island, Torai, is known today for its rugged beauty, but in the time of the myths, it was the edge of the known world. Balor chose the site carefully. He selected a high, inaccessible promontory known as Tormor, the Great Tower. It was a spike of rock rising sheer from the Atlantic Ocean, separated from the main body of the island by a treacherous chasm where the waters boiled and churned. It was a place where the salt spray coated everything in a layer of white rime, and the only sound was the roar of the surf and the cry of the gannets. Here, Balor commanded his masons to raise a tower of glass and granite. The inclusion of glass in the legends, often referred to as a tower of glass or Tor Gloin, is significant in Celtic mythology. It symbolizes the other world, a barrier that is visible yet impenetrable, a separation between the mundane and the magical. It also suggests a place of observation, where one is watched but cannot touch. The tower was built tall and smooth, with no stairs on the outside, and only a single, heavily guarded entrance high above the ground. Inside, however, it was furnished with all the luxury a Fomorian princess could desire. There were silks from the east, furs from the north, and gold from the mines of the deep earth. Yet, it was a gilded cage. Balor knew that walls alone were not enough. The mind was the true gateway. He needed guardians who were incorruptible, loyal, and capable of maintaining the great lie. He selected 12 matrons from the Fomorian women. These were not warriors, but nurses and teachers, women who were sworn to secrecy under pain of death by the evil eye. Their charge was simple yet absolute. Ethniu was to be raised in this high tower, and she was never, under any circumstances, to see a man. Furthermore, she was never to hear the name of a man. The very concept of the male gender was to be excised from her education. In her world, there were only women. The universe consisted of herself, her 12 nurses, and the distant, terrifying figure of her father, whom she saw only from a distance or through veils, a monstrous abstract force rather than a man. Imagine the childhood of Ethniu in this high, lonely place. As the years passed, she grew from a child into a woman of breathtaking beauty. The manuscripts describe her as having hair the color of the sun hitting the dark water, and skin as pale as the foam of the sea. She was the Sneet, the white flower of the Fomorians. Her days were spent in the upper chambers of the tower, learning the arts of embroidery, poetry, and song from the 12 matrons. She watched the seasons change through the thick glass windows. She saw the storms roll in from the Atlantic, the gray curtains of rain sweeping across the ocean. She saw the sun set in a blaze of red and gold, and the moon rise silver over the cliffs. But there was a hollowness in her existence. The human, or semi-divine, spirit intuitively understands duality. She saw the birds nesting on the cliffs, the male and the female tending to the chicks. She saw the seals playing in the cove below, pairs chasing each other through the kelp. When she asked her nurses about these things, why there were 2 kinds of gulls, 2 kinds of seals, the matrons would spin elaborate lies. They would tell her that these were merely different shapes of the same creature, or that the animals of the wild operated by laws different from the high people. They told her that she was unique, a being of singular creation, and that the world of her father was too dangerous, too chaotic for her delicate nature. They fed her fear to keep her safe. They told her that beyond the tower lay monsters and demons, not knowing that the greatest monster of all was the one who had imprisoned her. Yet, destiny is a fluid thing. It cannot be contained by stone or glass. Ethniu, in her isolation, developed a melancholy curiosity. She would stand on the high balcony, the wind whipping her long hair around her face, and gaze towards the mainland of Ireland, the distant green shadow on the horizon. She felt a pull she could not name, a longing for something that her vocabulary lacked the words to describe. While Balor sat on his throne, secure in the belief that he had outwitted prophecy, the threads of fate were already weaving a different tapestry. On that mainland, in the vibrant, magical society of the Tuatha Dé Danann, events were unfolding that would inevitably lead to the foot of Tor Mor. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, were the antithesis of the Fomorians. They were gods of skill, art, and civilization. Among them were 3 brothers, the sons of a chieftain. One of these brothers was named Cian. He was a lord of the Tuatha Dé, handsome, brave, and possessed of a wandering spirit. But Cian was not the catalyst for the breach of the tower. That role belonged to a cow, and not just any cow, but the Glas Gaibhnenn, the gray cow of the smith. It is here that the myth shifts from the grim brooding of the Fomorians to the high adventure of the Tuatha Dé. The fates were setting the stage. Balor, in his greed, would soon make a mistake. He would let his avarice override his caution. He would look not at his daughter, but at a prize belonging to another, and in doing so, he would invite the very doom he had spent a lifetime trying to prevent. The tower stood silent against the roaring sky. Inside, Ethniu slept, dreaming of faces she had never seen. Outside, the waves crashed against the rock, rhythmically eroding the foundation of Balor's security. The cycle was turning. The maiden was in the tower, the hero was on the mainland, and the villain was about to open the door. while the winds of paranoia howled around the solitary tower of Tormore on Tory Island. A different kind of fire burned on the mainland of Ireland. To understand the doom of Balor, we must turn our gaze from the desolate cliffs of the Fomorians to the vibrant, industrious heart of the Tuatha Dé Danann. If the Fomorians were the powers of the chaotic deep and the storm, the Tuatha Dé were the gods of civilization, art, and the cultivated earth. And among them, few were as revered or as vital as Gaibhnenn, the divine smith. Gaibhnenn was one of the Tuired Dé Danann, the three gods of art, alongside his brothers Credne, the silversmith, and Lugh the carpenter. His forge was not merely a workshop. It was a sanctuary of creation, located at a place known in the ancient texts as Druim na Tain, the Ridge of Fire, or sometimes Dwar na Tuan. Here, the air was always thick with the scent of ozone and molten metal, a sharp, metallic tang that signified the birth of weapons capable of slaying gods. Gaibhnenn was a master of his craft, a figure of immense strength and magical skill. It was said that he could forge a perfect spearhead with only 3 blows of his hammer, 1 to shape, 1 to sharpen, and 1 to finish. These were not ordinary weapons. They were enchanted instruments of war that, once cast, would never miss their mark and would inflict wounds that could never heal. But Gaibhnenn was more than an armorer. He was a provider. He presided over the fled Gaibhnenn, the feast of Gaibhnenn, where he served a magical ale that granted immortality and eternal youth to the Tuatha Dé Danann, protecting them from age and decay. Yet, for all his divine hammers and immortal ales, Gaibhnenn's most prized possession was not made of metal. It was a living, breathing miracle, the Glas Gaibhnenn. The Glas Gaibhnenn, often anglicized as the Glas Gaibhnenn, was a cow of such extraordinary nature that she remains one of the most enduring symbols in Irish folklore. Her name translates roughly to the gray or green cow of the smith. Descriptions of her vary, oscillating between the mystical and the earthly. Some legends paint her as a cow of pure white with green ears, while others describe her coat as a shimmering, verdant green, symbolizing the fertility of the Irish landscape itself. She was the bovine embodiment of abundance. It was recorded in the oral traditions that the Glas Gaibhnenn never ran dry. No matter how large the vessel placed beneath her udder, be it a simple pail, a cauldron, or a vat large enough to bathe a king, she would fill it to the brim with rich, creamy milk. In a time when wealth was measured in cattle and food security was a constant struggle against the harsh elements, this cow was a treasure beyond gold. She could feed an entire tribe, an entire army, without faltering. Her milk was not just sustenance, it was vitality, a liquid echo of the life-giving power of the earth goddess Danu. Because of her immense value, the Glas Gaibhnenn was a magnet for envy. Every chieftain, every king, and every cattle raider in Ireland coveted her. She was the ultimate prize. Gaibhnenn, preoccupied with the demands of his forge, beating out the swords and spears that would defend his people, could not watch her every hour of the day. And so the duty of guardianship fell to his brother, Cian. Cian, whose name means enduring or long, was a lord of the Tuatha Dé Danann in his own right. He was a warrior and a man of high standing, sometimes referred to as Cian mac Cainte. He understood the burden of his charge, The cow was not just livestock. She was the economic and nutritional engine of their clan. To lose her would be a catastrophe of divine proportions. The arrangement between the brothers was strict. When Gaibhnenn was at the anvil, Cian was the herdsman. He was never to leave the cow's side. He bound her with a magical halter, a rope that he held in his hand or tied to his belt at all times. He grazed her in the richest pastures surrounding the forge, his sword always loose in its scabbard, his eyes scanning the horizon for thieves. For years, this system held. The Tuatha Dé Danann flourished, fed by the endless milk of the Glas, and armed by the unbreaking blades of Gaibhnenn. But across the heaving gray waves of the Atlantic, a single terrible eye was watching. Balor, from the high ramparts of his fortress on Tory Island, had heard the tales of this wonder cow. His spies, the dark birds and the whispering winds, brought him reports of her bounty. Balor was a creature of greed, a hoarder of power. To him, the Glas Gaibhnenn was not just a source of milk. She was a symbol of the Tuatha Dé's prosperity, and therefore an affront to his own dominance. He desired her not out of need, for the Fomorians had the harvest of the sea, but out of a tyrant's compulsion to possess everything of value. He watched Cian through his spyglass of crystal, or perhaps through the remote viewing capabilities of his own dark druidry. He saw the vigilance of the brother. He saw the magical halter. He knew that a direct assault on the forge of Gaibhnenn would be costly. The smith god's weapons were lethal, and Cian was a skilled combatant. Balor, the master of the evil eye, was also a master of guile. He knew that where force might fail, trickery would succeed. And so the king of the Fomorians began to plot. He waited for the opportune moment, a moment when the brothers would be distracted by the urgency of their own industry. He waited for the smoke of the forge to grow thick, obscuring the vision of the guardians. He prepared a disguise, shedding his monstrous giant form to adopt a shape that would inspire not fear, but annoyance or pity. The trap was set, not with iron bars, but with a simple, poisonous lie. The day of the theft dawned like any other in the Druim Natene. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the air hummed with the rhythmic clang, clang, clang of Gaibhnenn's hammer, striking the anvil. The Tuatha Dé Danann were preparing for the inevitable conflicts that defined their age, and the demand for weapons was high. Gaibhnenn was working a piece of star metal, or perhaps a particularly stubborn alloy of iron, and the heat radiating from the forge distorted the air in shimmering waves. Cian stood in the pasture just outside the forge's open expanse. The grass here was lush and deep, fed by the magical manure of the beast he guarded. The Glas Gaibhnenn grazed contentedly, her massive head low, her tail swishing lazily. Cian held the halter rope firmly in his hand. He was joined on this day by another brother, in some versions named Samthain or Mac Samthain, who was assisting with the perimeter guard. It was into this scene of divine industry that Balor intruded. He did not come as a giant thundering across the hills, nor as a dark cloud. He came as a boy. Specifically, he adopted the guise of a small, red-headed youth, ragged and seemingly inconsequential. The choice of red hair is significant in Irish folklore. It is the mark of the trickster, the outsider, the being touched by fire and unpredictability. Balor walked boldly up to the brothers. He did not look at the cow. He looked at the forge, where Gaibhnenn was sweating over the anvil. The disguised king of the Fomorians feigned a look of shock and concern. He sidled up to Cian and his brother, his voice pitched high and full of urgent, conspiratorial whisper. "My lords," the boy said, pointing a trembling finger into the dark interior of the forge. "Is that your brother in there? The great smith?" Cian, annoyed by the interruption but not alarmed, nodded. "It is. Be off with you, boy." "I would be off," the boy replied, his eyes wide with feigned scandal. "But I cannot bear to see such waste. Do you know what he is doing? He is using all the steel. He is ruining the alloy. He is making the swords for himself and leaving the dross for you. By the time he is finished with this batch, there will be no metal left for your weapons." The lie was simple, designed to prey on the sibling rivalry that often simmers even among gods. It pricked Cian's pride. He knew Gaibhnenn was the master smith, but the thought of being cheated out of the finest steel, of being left with inferior blades while his brother hoarded the best work, sparked a flash of irrational anger. "What are you saying?" Cian demanded, stepping closer to the boy but still holding the halter. "Go and see for yourself," the boy urged. "He is twisting the metal even now. If you don't stop him, the work is ruined." In that moment of heated judgment, Cian made the mistake that would change the history of Ireland. He turned to his brother Samhain, or simply trusted the situation momentarily, and thrust the halter into his hand. "Hold her," Cian snapped. "I will have words with Gaibhnenn." Cian stormed into the forge, the roar of the bellows drowning out his footsteps. "Brother," he shouted, "are you cheating us of the steel?" Gaibhnenn paused, his hammer raised, his face streaked with soot. He looked at Cian with genuine confusion. "Cheating? I am forging the defense of the realm. What madness is this?" It took only a few seconds, perhaps a minute, for the misunderstanding to be cleared. But a minute was all Balor needed. Outside, the red-headed boy's demeanor shifted instantly. The moment Cian disappeared into the smoke, Balor dropped the facade of the helpless youth. He swelled with power, or simply used his immense strength in the smaller form. He snatched the halter from the startled grasp of the remaining guard, who, in many versions, is easily overpowered or tricked as well. Balor did not lead the cow gently. He knew that the Glas Gaibhnenn, loyal to her masters, would resist being taken by a Fomorian. So he employed a cruel and clever tactic, often cited in the folklore of County Donegal. He grabbed the cow by the tail. He dragged her backward. This served a dual purpose. First, it forced the animal to move against her will. Second, and more brilliantly, it confused the tracks. Anyone looking at the hoofprints in the mud would think the cow was walking towards the forge, not away from it. By the time Cian and Gaibhnenn rushed back out, alerted by the commotion or simply realizing the folly of their argument, the pasture was empty. The green grass was torn up, the tracks were a confusing muddle, and the horizon was empty. Cian ran to the coast. There, in the distance, he saw a dark shape moving across the water. Balor had already reached the sea. Whether he dragged the cow through the waves or loaded her onto a black ship, the result was the same. The Glas Gaibhnenn was gone. She was being taken to the cold, rocky prison of Tuired Island. The despair that fell upon Cian was absolute. He knew the reputation of Balor. He knew the prophecy. A druid he consulted confirmed his worst fears. So long as Balor lives, the cow shall never be brought back, for no one can go within reach of his evil eye and survive. The theft was a disaster. The Tuatha Dé Danann had lost their source of endless abundance, but for Tuired, it was personal. He had been tricked. He had failed his brother and his people. The shame burned hotter than the forge fire. But from that shame rose a cold, hard resolve. He would get the cow back. He did not care about the eye. He did not care about the tower. He would cross the sea to the island of monsters. He did not know yet that his quest for the cow would lead him to a prize far greater and far more dangerous than livestock. He was marching toward the Tower of Glass, toward the forbidden princess Ethniu, and toward the fulfillment of the very prophecy Balor believed he had escaped. The theft of the Glas Gaibhnenn was a blow that echoed through the halls of the Tuatha Dé Danann, but for Tuired, it was a wound that festered in the soul. He stood on the rocky shores of the mainland, staring across the churning gray expanse of the Atlantic toward the ominous silhouette of Tuired Island. The distance was not merely physical. It was a chasm between worlds. To cross it by ordinary ship was suicide. Balor's fleet prowled the waters like hungry sharks, and the eye, that terrible, lid-bound singularity, watched the horizon with a vigilance that withered hope. Tuired knew that force of arms would avail him nothing. Gaibhnenn, in his forge, raged and battered the red-hot iron, swearing vengeance, but Tuired understood that a sword, no matter how sharp, cannot cut through a curse. He needed a power that operated on a different frequency, a subtle magic that could slip beneath the gaze of the Fomorian King. He needed the old magic, the kind that lived in the roots of the mountains and the whispers of the wind. And so, turning his back on the sea, Tuired journeyed inland. He did not seek a warrior or a king, but a figure whispered about in the fearful folklore of the peasantry. He sought Birog of the mountain. Birog is one of the most enigmatic figures in the Lugh cycle. In the oral traditions collected in the 19th century, particularly those from County Donegal, she is described variously as a banshee, a druidess, or a fairy woman of immense power. She was not of the Tuatha Dé Danann, nor was she a Fomorian. She was something older, perhaps a remnant of the land's primordial consciousness, a spirit of the wind and the mist. Tuired found her dwelling in a place where the mist clung perpetually to the heather, a cave mouth that exhaled the cold breath of the earth. The meeting was not one of negotiation, but of destiny. Birog, with eyes that held the shifting gray of a storm cloud, knew why he had come. She knew of the cow, yes, for the Glas Gaibhnenn was a creature of the earth's bounty, and the earth mourned her loss. But Birog also knew of the prophecy. She saw the threads of fate that connected the distraught warrior before her to the lonely princess in the glass tower. "You seek the beast of bounty," Birog's voice would have rasped, like dry leaves skittering over stone. "But to retrieve the milk, you must first spill the seed. The path to the cow lies through the tower." The bargain was struck. Birog agreed to transport Tuired to Tuired Island, not by sail or oar, but by the pathways of the air. She would cloak him in magic, shielding him from the burning gaze of Balor. But this aid came with a condition, unspoken perhaps, but woven into the magic. Tuired was merely the instrument. The true purpose of the journey was not the recovery of livestock, but the breaking of Balor's unnatural stasis. The spell Birog cast was a masterpiece of atmospheric magic. She summoned a wind, not a gale that would alert the Fomorian weather watchers, but a soft, insidious breeze. She wrapped Cian in a cloak of glamour, a fifth Fath spell that obscured his true form. To the eyes of any guard who might spot them, they would appear as nothing more than drifting seabirds or a patch of fog rolling in off the ocean. Together, the warrior and the druidess lifted from the earth. They crossed the perilous stretch of water, the waves crashing white and angry far below. As they approached Tory Island, the immense fortress of Balor loomed out of the gloom. The Tor Mor, the great tower where Ethnew was imprisoned, stood apart, a needle of rock piercing the sky. It was a place of absolute isolation, surrounded by the screaming of gulls and the roar of the surf. Birog's magic allowed them to land softly on the high balcony of the tower, a place no man had ever set foot. The air here was thin and cold. Inside, through the heavy glass windows, the glow of hearth fires flickered. But the tower was not unguarded. The 12 matrons, the fierce Fomorian governesses, tasked by Balor with keeping his daughter ignorant of the world, were vigilant. They were large, formidable women, chosen for their loyalty and their strength. To enter, force was again useless. An alarm raised would bring Balor's wrath down upon them in seconds. Birog, however, was a mistress of the mind as well as the elements. She did not draw a weapon. Instead, she drew a breath of the tower's air and exhaled a sleeping enchantment. It was a subtle perfume, smelling of lavender and poppy, that drifted through the cracks in the masonry. Or, as some versions of the tale suggest, she disguised Cian as a woman, a 13th matron, and they entered under the guise of seeking shelter from a sudden storm. Once inside, Birog deepened the spell. She moved among the 12 guardians, weaving a lethargy into their limbs. One by one, the matrons slumped over their embroidery, their heads nodding, their snores joining the rhythm of the wind outside. The path to the inner sanctum, the private chamber of the princess, was open. Cian stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had come for a cow, a creature of economic necessity. But as he pushed open the heavy wooden door to the princess's room, the cow was forgotten. The chamber of Ethnew was a sanctuary of silence. Tapestries woven with scenes of the sea and the sky, scenes devoid of men or war, hung from the walls, insulating the room from the harsh stone. In the center, illuminated by the soft light of oil lamps and the pale moonlight filtering through the glass, sat Ethnew. She was more beautiful than the legends had promised. Her isolation had preserved an innocence and an ethereal quality that struck Cian with the force of a physical blow. She looked up as the door opened, expecting one of her nurses. Instead, she saw a figure that defied her entire understanding of the world. Balor's decree had been absolute. Ethnew was never to know what a man was. She had been taught that the world was female or neuter. Yet, the human soul is not so easily deceived. Dreams, the one realm Balor could not police, had visited her. In her sleep, she had seen faces that were not like the faces of her nurses, faces with hard angles, bearded chins, and eyes filled with a different kind of fire. When Cian lowered the hood of his cloak, or shed Birog's disguise, revealing his masculine form, Ethnew did not scream. She did not recoil in horror at this monster. Instead, A shock of recognition passed through her. She stood, her hand going to her throat. This was the face from her dreams. This was the missing half of the world that her soul had intuitively mourned. For Cian, the mission to retrieve the Glas Gaibhnenn dissolved into the background. He was a prince of the Tuatha Dé Danann, a being of passion and vitality, standing before the daughter of his enemy, a woman of tragic beauty. The attraction was instantaneous and overwhelming. It was not merely lust. It was the magnetic pull of destiny, the universe conspiring to correct the imbalance Balor had created. Birog, standing in the shadows, watched with the dispassionate eye of nature. She knew that this union was the fulcrum upon which the history of Ireland would turn. She cast a ward of silence over the room, ensuring that no sound would escape to wake the sleeping matrons. The interaction between Cian and Ethniu was tender and urgent. They spoke in whispers, bridging the gap between their hostile races with words of wonder. He told her of the world outside, of the green hills, the rivers, and the people who lived and loved freely. She told him of her solitude, her dreams, and the oppressive shadow of her father. In that high tower, surrounded by the enemy, they found a profound intimacy. The mythologies are discreet yet clear. They lay together. It was a union of the earth and the deep sea, of light and shadow. In that act of love, the prophecy that Balor had spent a lifetime trying to prevent was fulfilled. The seed was sown. The grandson was conceived. Cian wished to take her with him. He wanted to spirit her away from this prison, to bring her back to the mainland. But Birog intervened. The magic that had brought them there was waning. The sleeping spell on the matrons would not hold forever, and the winds were shifting. To carry Ethniu, who was unpracticed in the arts of magical flight, would be too slow, too dangerous. They would be caught. "You have what you came for," Birog might have whispered, referring to the destiny rather than the cow. "We must leave, or we all die." With a heavy heart, Cian promised to return. He left Ethniu with a kiss and a vow, slipping back out into the night with the druidess. They descended the tower, and in the confusion and shadow of the night, they managed to liberate the Glas Gaibhnenn, for the cow had been kept in the pastures near the fortress, and Birog's magic aided them in spiriting the beast back across the waves. Balor awoke the next morning to a double rage. The cow was gone, stolen from under his very nose. His fury was like a hurricane. He raged at his guards. He raged at the sea. But he did not look in the tower. He did not suspect the deeper violation. He assumed the theft was a raid, a military action. He did not know that the true theft had happened in the womb of his daughter. Months passed on Tory Island. Up in the Tower of Glass, a terrifying miracle was unfolding. Ethniu's body began to change. The matrons, waking from their enchanted slumber with foggy memories, eventually noticed the swelling of her belly. Panic set in. They knew the penalty for failure. They knew what Balor would do if he discovered they had allowed a man, or a spirit, as they might have rationalized it, to enter. They tried to hide it. They adjusted her robes. They kept her from the windows. But nature cannot be hidden forever. When the time came, Ethniu went into labor. The agony and the joy of birth filled the high chamber, and she did not give birth to just one child. In the oldest and most dramatic versions of the tale, she gave birth to triplets, 3 sons, squalling and strong, with the blood of the Tuatha Dé and the Fomorians mingling in their veins. The sound of a newborn's cry is distinct. It pierces through stone and wind, and on this day the wind carried the sound down from the high tower to the fortress below. Balor paused in his hall. He tilted his massive head. He heard it, a sound that should not exist in his world, the cry of a male child from the direction of the forbidden tower. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The prophecy, the grandson, his precautions, his tower, his matrons, all had failed. The fear that gripped him was colder than the ocean depths. It was followed instantly by a murderous, tyrannical resolve. He stormed the tower, tearing the doors from their hinges. The matrons cowered before him, begging for mercy. He ignored them. He marched into Ethniu's chamber. There, he saw her, clutching 3 bundles of cloth. Balor did not see grandchildren. He saw assassins. He saw his own death, wrapped in swaddling clothes. There was no hesitation, no grandfatherly instinct. There was only the survival instinct of a monster. He snatched the infants from his daughter's arms. She screamed, clawing at his iron armor, but he was a giant, and she was weakened by birth. He gathered the 3 babies into a rough sheet or a cloak, pinning them together with a massive brooch or simply bundling them tight. He did not kill them there. He called for a servant, a man named Celtic, or perhaps a trusted executioner. His order was simple and brutal. "Take these things," he roared, gesturing to the bundle that contained his own flesh and blood. "Take them to the whirlpool, drown them, and bring me back proof that the prophecy is dead." The servant took the bundle. Ethniu collapsed in grief, her wails joining the storm outside. Balor stood panting, believing once again that he had cheated fate. But he had forgotten one thing. The pin that held the cloak was loose, and the sea, the domain of his ancestors, was not always his ally. As the servant carried the bundle across the cliffs towards the dark, churning waters of the whirlpool, one of the babies, a child who shone with a strange inner light, wriggled free. He slipped from the folds of the cloak and fell, not into the water, but into a small, sheltered inlet of soft sand. The servant, terrified of Balor and eager to be done with the grim task, did not notice. He threw the rest of the bundle into the crushing depths, believing he had drowned all 3. But one remained. One survived. The boy in the sand was Lugh, and the long arm of destiny had just reached out to catch him. The servant of Balor stood on the precipice of the dark cliffs, his chest heaving with the exertion of the climb and the terror of his task. Below him, the whirlpool, known as the Gauth Dobhair, churned with a violence that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth. He held the bundle of cloth, the shroud that contained the supposed future of the Fomorian line, and with a shudder he cast it into the abyss. He watched it fall, a small speck of white against the hungry gray of the Atlantic. He saw it strike the water and disappear beneath the foam. Satisfied, or perhaps simply desperate to flee the scene of such a crime, he turned and scrambled back toward the fortress to report to his master that the prophecy had been drowned. But the fates are not so easily satisfied by water. As previously mentioned, the pin of the cloak had come loose, while 2 of the infants were indeed lost to the tragedy of the deep. returning to the chaotic element of their grandfather's people. The third child, the one who shone with an inner radiance, had slipped free during the fall. He landed not in the crushing vortex, but in the calm waters of a small, sheltered inlet nearby. This bay, known in folklore as Port Nundeor, or the Port of Tears, became the cradle of the Savior. The infant floated there, buoyed by the salt water, crying out to a world that had tried to kill him. It is here that the myth diverges into several beautiful streams, but the most enduring and mythologically potent version involves the intervention of Manannán mac Lir. Manannán was the sea god, the lord of the waves, a deity who transcended the conflict between the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fomorians. He was the guardian of the otherworld, the pilot of the boat, Squab Tuin, the wave sweeper, and a being of immense wisdom and magic. Manannán had been watching. The gods of the sea see all that touches their domain. He saw the cruelty of Balor, and he saw the spark of destiny in the child bobbing in the bay. Rising from the surf in his chariot drawn by horses that were made of sea foam, he scooped the child from the water. He did not return the boy to Cian immediately, for he knew that nowhere in Ireland was safe from the gaze of Balor, so long as the child was helpless. Instead, Manannán wrapped the infant in his cloak of mist, a garment that makes the wearer invisible to mortal and divine eyes alike, and spirited him away. They traveled across the western ocean to Emain Ablach, the Isle of Apples, a place often associated with the Land of Promise, or the Avalon of Arthurian legend. Here, time flowed differently. It was a land of eternal summer, where the trees were heavy with golden fruit, and sickness was unknown. But a child needs a mother, and Manannán, for all his power, was a god of the wild sea. He entrusted the fosterage of the boy to one of the most noble figures in Irish mythology, Queen Tailtiu. Tailtiu was not of the Tuatha Dé Danann, nor was she a Fomorian. She was the last queen of the Fir Bolg, the race that had inhabited Ireland before the coming of the gods. She was a figure of immense dignity and tragedy, a woman who represented the sovereignty of the land itself. She took the boy, whom they named Lugh, into her care. The raising of Lugh was a project of divine perfection. He was not merely fed and clothed, he was crafted. Under the tutelage of Manannán and the nurturing of Tailtiu, he was taught every art known to existence. Most gods were masters of one domain. Gaibhnenn was the smith. Ogma was the champion and scholar. Dianchecht was the healer. But Luke was taught to be the Samuldanach, the master of all arts. He learned to forge a sword better than a smith, to harp better than a bard, to heal better than a physician, and to calculate the stars better than a druid. He learned the arts of war and the arts of peace. Manannán gave him gifts of immense power. He gave him the sword Fragarach, the Answerer, which could cut through any armor and forced anyone at its point to speak the truth. He gave him the boat Squab Tuin, which could sail without wind. He gave him the horse Enbar, which could gallop over land and sea with equal ease. Tailtiu, in turn, gave him the strength of the earth. She cleared the great forests of Coil Chuan so that the land could be tilled for her foster son's people. It is said she worked so hard to prepare the land for him that she died of exhaustion, a sacrifice that Lugh would later honor by establishing the funeral games of Lugnasad, a festival of harvest and athletic competition that persists in spirit to this day. While Lugh grew in strength and splendor in the hidden otherworld, growing into a warrior whose face shone like the sun, the world he had left behind was falling into darkness. The escape of the child was unknown to Balor, but the shadow of Balor was lengthening across Ireland. The prophecy had been silenced, or so the king believed, and with that fear removed, his cruelty knew no bounds. Back on the mainland of Eriu, the golden age of the Tuatha Dé Danann had shattered. The catalyst for this decline was the first battle of Mag Tuired, fought against the Fir Bolg. Although the Tuatha Dé had won the war, they had lost their king's perfection. Nuada, their noble leader, had his arm severed in combat by the Fir Bolg champion Shreng. By the strict laws of Danann kingship, a king had to be physically unblemished. A mutilated king could not bring fertility to the land. His injury would reflect in the harvest. Nuada was forced to abdicate. In a desperate bid to unite the fractious tribes of Ireland, and perhaps to appease the threatening Fomorians, the Tuatha Dé Danann made a fateful political decision. They chose a new king, not from their pure-blood ranks, but from a mixed lineage. They chose Bress. Bress was known as Bress the Beautiful. Eoked Bress. On the surface, he was the perfect specimen of kingship. He was tall, golden-haired, and possessed a charisma that enchanted the court. His mother was Eriu, a goddess of the Tuatha Dé, but his father was Alatha, a prince of the Fomorians. The Tuatha Dé hoped that Bress would be the bridge between the two peoples, a peace weaver who would end the threat of Balor's raiders. They were catastrophically wrong. Bress had his mother's beauty, but he had his father's heart, and behind him, pulling the strings of this puppet king, loomed the shadow of Balor of the Evil Eye. The reign of Bress is remembered as one of the darkest chapters in Irish mythology. It was not a reign of fire and sword, but of cold, grinding oppression. Bress did not act like a Celtic king, whose primary duty was hospitality and generosity. Instead, he acted like a Fomorian tribute collector. He imposed a crushing tax on the gods. Every household in Ireland was forced to pay a tribute to the Fomorians, a portion of their milk, their grain, and their kneading troughs. But the Fomorians were tricky. They demanded the milk of all dun-colored cows, and then used magic to singe all the cattle of Ireland dun, thereby claiming every drop of milk in the land. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the proud gods of art and light, were reduced to slavery. The descriptions in the Cath Maige Tuired are vivid and humiliating. Ogma, the champion of the gods, the inventor of the Ogham script and the master of eloquence, was forced to carry bundles of firewood from the forests to the king's fortress. He was weakened by hunger, his great strength fading as he hauled timber for a king who despised him. The Dagda, the good god, the all-father figure of the pantheon, suffered even worse degradation. He, who controlled the weather and the crops, was forced to dig trenches and build earthworks around Bress's fort of Rath Bress. He stood knee-deep in mud, digging with a spade, ridiculed by the Fomorian overseers. Bress withheld the two things essential for life and community: fire and entertainment. Their knives were not greased at his table, the texts say, meaning there was no meat. Their breaths did not smell of ale, meaning there were no feasts. The great halls of Tara, usually filled with the music of harps and the reciting of poetry, fell silent and cold. Balor, watching from Tory Island, was pleased. He did not need to invade. He had conquered Ireland through economics and politics. His grandson in spirit, for Bress was his kin, was stripping the Tuatha Dé of their dignity. Balor believed he had won. The prophecy was dead, his enemies were enslaved, and the wealth of Ireland flowed into his coffers. But tyranny has a breaking point. The spirit of the Tuatha Dé Danann was bending, but it had not broken. The turning point came not with a sword, but with a word. A bard named Cairbre, son of Ogma, came to the court of Bress seeking hospitality. He was a poet, a member of the Aisling, the visionary class. By law and custom, he should have been given the best seat, the best meat, and the finest ale. Instead, Bress lodged him in a small dark hut where the wind whistled through the cracks. He was given dry, stale cakes to eat and water to drink. In the morning, Cairbre rose, cold and hungry. He did not draw a weapon. He stood in the courtyard of the king and spoke the first satire ever made in Ireland. In the Celtic tradition, a satire, Glas Gaibhnenn, was not merely an insult. It was a magical curse that could physically blister the face of the victim and destroy their reputation and authority. Cairbre chanted, "Without food for the mouth on a quick dish, without a cow's milk for the calf to grow, without a man's shelter when the night gloom falls, without paying a company of storytellers, let that be the condition of Bress." The words hung in the air like a poisonous fog. When Bress awoke, blotches appeared on his face, the physical manifestation of his failure as a king. The spell of his beauty was broken. The Tuatha Dé Danann looked at him and saw him for what he was, a stingy, cruel Fomorian pretender. At the same time, Nuada, the former king, had been healed. Dian checked the physician, and his son Miach had crafted a working arm of silver and later flesh for him. Nuada of the silver hand, Nuada Erget Lam, was whole again. The Tuatha Dé Danann rose up. They demanded Bress abdicate. Remarkably, Bress, shamed by the satire and lacking the support of the people, fled. He did not go quietly into exile, however. He ran back to his father's people. He ran to the Fomorians. He ran to Balor. Bress knelt before Balor on Tory Island, begging for an army to retake his throne. Balor, looking down at the disgraced king, smiled. The iron lid rattled as he shifted on his throne. This was the excuse he had been waiting for. It was time to stop hiding behind taxes and puppet kings. It was time for the final annihilation. "Gather the ships," Balor commanded, his voice like grinding stones. "Gather the hosts of the deep. We will not just take the throne. We will hook the island of Ireland to our ships and drag it into the sea." War was coming. But unbeknownst to Balor, as his black ships prepared to sail, a young warrior was riding across the waves on a white horse. Lugh was coming home. The prophecy was not dead. It was fully grown, armed with a sword of light, and very, very angry. While Balor gathered his monstrous host on the stark cliffs of Tory Island, preparing to drag Ireland into the abyss, a different kind of storm was approaching the royal fortress of Tara. The Tuatha Dé Danann were a broken people, their spirit crushed under the tyranny of Bress and the looming shadow of the Fomorians. Nuada, restored to physical wholeness but psychologically weary, sat on a throne that felt increasingly fragile. The great halls, once filled with the music of the Shihi, were silent, save for the murmurs of fearful gods. It was into this atmosphere of despair that the Savior arrived. He did not come with an army at his back, but as a solitary figure riding out of the mist of the west. He rode Enbar of the flowing mane, a steed that traveled over the dry land and the ocean waves with equal ease, its hooves striking sparks of white fire from the stones. He wore the cloak of Manannan, which shimmered with the shifting colors of the sea, and at his hip hung Fragarak, the sword that could cut through the fabric of lies. This was Lugh. He was known as Lugh Lamfada, Lugh of the long arm, not because of a physical deformity, but because his reach, his influence, and his skill extended beyond that of any other being. He was also the Ildanach, or Samildanach, the master of all arts. The arrival of Lugh at the gates of Tara is one of the most meticulously recorded and celebrated sequences in Irish mythology, preserved in the Cath Mage Tuired. It serves as the ultimate validation of his competence to lead the war against Balor. Lugh approached the gatekeeper, a deity named Gamal, who barred the way with a wooden staff. The law of Tara was strict. No one could enter the royal fortress during a feast unless they possessed an art or a skill that was not already represented within. "Who are you?" Gamal demanded, squinting against the radiance that seemed to emanate from the stranger's face. "I am Lugh, son of Cian, son of Dian Shecht, and of Ethniu, daughter of Balor," he announced, claiming his dual heritage openly. "I seek entry to the court of the king." "No one enters here without an art," Gamal recited. "What art do you practice?" Lugh smiled, an expression that held the confidence of the sun. "Question me," he said. "I am a carpenter." "We have no need of a carpenter," Gamal replied. "We have Luchta, the son of Luachide. He is a master carpenter." "I am a smith," Lugh countered. "We have a smith," said the gatekeeper. "Gaibhnenn is within. His hammers never tire." "I am a champion," Lugh said, his hand resting on his sword. "We have a champion," Gamal said proudly. "Ogma, the son of Ethliu, is here." "I am a harper," Lugh said. "We have a harper," the gatekeeper replied, unimpressed. "Abkhan, the son of Bichelmos, plays for us." Lugh continued, listing every noble skill known to the Gaelic world. He claimed to be a poet and historian, but they had Ferron. He claimed to be a sorcerer, but they had their druids. He claimed to be a physician, but they had Dian Checht. He claimed to be a cupbearer, but they had masters of the feast. He claimed to be a brazier, a worker of bronze, but they had Credna. Finally, Lugh played his trump card. He looked the gatekeeper in the eye and said, "Go to the king. Ask him if he has any one man who possesses all these arts together. If he does, I shall not enter." Gamal, stunned by the logic and the audacity of the claim, ran to the hall. "My lord Nuada," he cried, "a warrior has come to the gate. He is called the Samildanach. For all the things that your people practice singly, he practices alone. He is the man of every art." Nuada, sensing the turning of the tide, ordered a test. He sent out the heavy fidchel board, a strategic board game similar to chess, to the gate. Luke won all the games, moving the pieces with the speed of thought. This feat earned him the title, Luke of the Fidchel. Nuada ordered him admitted. When Lugh walked into the hall, it was said that the room grew brighter, as if the sun had risen indoors. He sat in the sage's seat, and Ogma, the champion, challenged him to a feat of strength. Ogma hurled a massive flagstone, which required 80 oxen to move, through the side of the hall and out again. Lugh not only threw it back, but repaired the wall with a wave of his hand. Then Lugh took the harp. He played the 3 noble strains of Irish music, the Goltraí, sorrow strain, which made the gods weep for their suffering, the Jantraí, joy strain, which made them laugh and forget their cares, and the Suantraí, sleep strain, which lulled them into a restful sleep, healing their weary minds. When the gods awoke, Nuada knew what must be done. He understood that his own arm, though silver and flesh, was not strong enough to break the hold of Balor. He stood up and performed an act of supreme humility. He vacated the throne. He gave the king's seat to Lugh for 13 days, granting him absolute command of the Tuatha Dé Danann for the duration of the war council. For a full year, Lugh prepared the gods for the coming apocalypse. This was not a hasty charge. It was a mobilized economy of war. He called the great craftsmen to a secret council at a place called the Forge of the Glens. He asked Gaibhnenn, "What power will you wield for me in the battle?" Gaibhnenn answered, "Though the men of Ireland continue the battle for 7 years, for every spear that separates from its shaft or every sword that breaks, I will forge a new weapon in the same place. No spear point which my hand forges shall miss its mark. No skin which it pierces shall taste life again. Balor's Dolb, the Fomorian smith, cannot do this." He asked Dian Checht, the physician, "What power will you wield?" Dian Checht answered, "Any man who is slain, unless his head is cut off, or his membrane of the brain or his spinal marrow severed, I will restore to life. I will sing the incantation over the well of Sline, and they will rise the next morning as whole as they were before." He asked Credne the brazier, "What of you?" Credne promised rivets for the spears, hilts for the swords, and rims for the shields, all made instantly and perfectly. He asked the druids, the witches, and the cupbearers. The druids promised to rain fire and blood on the Fomorian faces. The witches promised to enchant the trees and stones to fight. The cupbearers promised to hide the water sources from the enemy, while keeping the Tuatha Dé hydrated. Luke was assembling a machine of total war. He was uniting the magical, the martial, and the logistical. He was the antithesis of Balor. Balor was a singular point of destruction. Luke was a network of creation. Across the sea, the Fomorian fleet launched. It was a forest of masts that darkened the ocean. Balor stood on the deck of his flagship, his great eyelid lowered, his heart cold. He felt the gathering power in the east, but he did not fear it. He had the eye, and he had the prophecy, which he believed he had drowned. He did not know that the general marshalling the armies against him was the very grandson he thought dead. The stage was set at Mag Tuired, Moytura, the Plain of Pillars, in County Sligo. This geography is scarred by the memory of the conflict. Megalithic tombs and stone circles still dot the landscape, said to be the graves of the fallen. The Second Battle of Mag Tuired was not merely a clash of armies. It was a collision of cosmologies. The Fomorians arrived like a plague. Their ships beached, and they poured onto the land, hideous giants, dark druids, and warriors clad in the skins of sea beasts. Leading them were the terrible kings, Indech, son of Dé Danann, Elatha the Golden, and Tethra, who would later rule the realm of the dead warriors. But towering above them all, carried on a massive wagon or walking with earth-shaking strides, was Balor. His head was low, his eye draped in its heavy cloaks and leathers. The iron ring in his eyelid clinked with every step, a death knell ringing across the valley. The battle began on Samhain, the time when the veil between worlds is thinnest. For days, it was a slaughter. The Tuatha Dé Danann fought with the brilliance of their arts. Gaibhnu's weapons bit deep into Fomorian flesh. The dead warriors were carried to the Well of Slain, where Dianchecht chanted them back to life, allowing them to return to the fray the next dawn. This resurrection engine terrified the Fomorians, who had to kill their enemies 2 or 3 times over. Balor, seeing his forces stalled by this magical resilience, grew impatient. He ordered his personal guard to clear a path. He strode toward the front lines. The Tuatha Dé Danann parted before him like water. They knew what was coming. Nuada of the Silver Hand, the High King, rode out to meet him. Nuada was a brave and noble god, but he belonged to the old order. He engaged Balor in single combat. Swords flashed, sparks flew, but the contest was unequal. Balor did not even need the full power of the eye. With a brutal swing of his mace or a partial gaze of his malice, he struck Nuada down. The Silver King fell, his head severed from his body. Macha, the goddess of war and sovereignty, fell beside him. The death of the king sent a shockwave through the Tuatha Dé. Their line wavered. The Fomorians roared, sensing victory. Balor stood over the body of Nuada and laughed, a sound like rocks sliding down a mountain. He called to his attendants. "Lift the lid," Balor commanded. "I wish to see this Samildanac, who thinks he can challenge the deep. I will burn him and his little arts into the dust." The 4 champions grabbed the chains attached to the iron ring in his eyelid. They heaved. The lid began to rise. A beam of necrotic red light began to spill onto the battlefield, withering the grass and steaming the blood on the ground. At the other end of the field, Luke saw the movement. He had been kept back from the front lines by the Tuatha Dé, who feared losing their precious savior. But now, with Nuada dead, Luke broke free of his protectors. He did not draw his sword. He did not couch a lance. Lugh reached into his pouch. He did not pull out a divine thunderbolt or a magical spear. He pulled out a stone. This was not an ordinary stone. It was a tathlum, a magical sling stone crafted specifically for this moment. Traditions vary on its composition. Some say it was made from the blood of toads, bears, and vipers, mixed with sea sand and hardened with incantations. Others say it was a simple, smooth rock from the earth of Ireland, representing the land rejecting the tyrant. Lugh loaded the stone into his sling. He began to spin it. The hum of the sling rose to a shriek. Balor's eye was halfway open. The destructive beam was cutting a swath through the ranks of the Tuatha Dé. He turned his massive head toward the shining figure of Lugh. "Is that him?" Balor sneered. "That little spark?" Lugh released the stone. It flew across the battlefield faster than thought. It did not aim for the forehead or the throat. It aimed for the center of the terror. The stone struck the evil eye dead center. The force of the impact was cataclysmic. Luke's arm, the long arm, had imparted a kinetic energy that defied physics. The stone did not just blind Balor, it drove the eyeball backward through his own skull. The massive eye, pulsing with all the accumulated venom and dark magic of centuries, was dislodged. It exited the back of Balor's head. And here lies the ultimate irony of the prophecy. The eye turned its gaze upwards and backwards. As Balor fell, his eye, now facing the sky or looking back toward his own lines, unleashed its final uncontrollable death beam. It did not hit the Tuatha Dé Danann. It swept across the Fomorian host. The beam incinerated Balor's own bodyguards. It burned through the ranks of the Fomorians. It turned the greatest of their warriors to ash. According to the Dindsenchus, lore of places, the eye burned a hole in the earth so deep that the water rushed in to fill it, creating Loch Nasul, the Lake of the Eye, in County Sligo. Balor, the king of the Fomorians, crashed to the earth. His reign was over. He had been killed by his grandson, just as the Druids had foretold. He had built a tower, imprisoned a daughter, and enslaved a nation to stop this moment. But every step he took had only led him closer to the slingstone. The Fomorians, seeing their king fallen and their ranks decimated by his own power, broke and fled. They were driven back into the sea, never to return as a conquering power. The tyranny of the deep was ended. The era of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the age of light and art, had truly begun. Lugh stood over the body of his grandfather. It was a moment of victory, but also of profound mythological weight. The old, chaotic, elemental force had given way to the new, ordered, civilized god. The cycle was complete. Yet even in death, Balor left a scar. The land of Sligo still bears the marks of the battle. The folklore of the evil eye persists, a reminder that while the light may win, the darkness is always watching from the deep history of the world. So ended the life of Balor of the Evil Eye, not with a whimper, but with a gaze that burned the world one last time. And that is the tale of Balor. From the storm-lashed rocks of Tory to the bloody plains of Moytura, his story is a testament to the inescapable nature of fate. No tower is high enough, no eyelid heavy enough to shut out destiny. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darkness of Celtic mythology, please leave a like on the video and subscribe to Hearths of Myths. Let the soothing sounds of the legends guide you into a peaceful slumber. Good night.